Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Maya Finoh. I use they, them pronouns. I am a fat, Black, queer, non-binary culture worker, writer, and educator, born in so-called North Carolina, which is occupied Ino Okonichi land. And I'm currently based in Brooklyn, New York, Occupy Lenape land. I'm first generation West African, so the majority of my ancestors were the first peoples of the land now known as Sierra Leone. I'm Shabro, Mende, and Kono primarily. I really want to thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to learn with me for a bit. We'll be spending the next hour coming to an understanding of anti-Blackness and how we can challenge it to reach collective liberation. Thank you so much. So what are the origins of structural anti-Blackness? Who participates and maintains it? This class will create an understanding of the history of anti-Blackness systemically and socially, and discuss how we might identify, challenge, and condemn anti-Blackness in our liberation movement and movement work by engaging in the lifelong transformative practice of respecting all Black lives. So we're going to be moving through a lot of content, but my hope is that you all look at the further reading and resource list that I'll be sharing afterwards for more information. We're first going to start at the origins of race and racial hierarchy, then move on to defining anti-Blackness. Afterward, we'll be looking at who all participates in anti-Blackness via a few case studies. Then we'll examine an instance of anti-Blackness in the movement organizing context. And finally, explore a few ideas of how we can engage in the practice of challenging and condemning anti-Blackness in our various communities or whatever space we create change in. So, you know, I'm coming to this work from the perspective of someone who studied historical and contemporary Black freedom struggles and organized in various movement formations over the past 7 years, from prison and police abolitionist student organizing in college to Black queer feminist organizing in New York City. So the lens that I use to explore anti-Blackness is rooted in the study of the material conditions of Blackness, specifically the realities of being Black in the heart of empire, you know, the so-called United States. And very briefly before I delve in, I just want to say that anti-Blackness, anti-Black violence is a difficult thing to discuss and it affects me personally. So I just want to make sure all the Black folks in the room take care of yourselves. Yeah, next please. So let's begin by talking a bit about racial hierarchy and its origins. Next slide, please. So race is not biological, it's socially constructed. We can trace the origins of race to the rise of capitalism in Western Europe. In the 1400s, capitalism brought a need to categorize, really a need to distinguish between the haves and the have-nots, and to label those who will be exploited. It can be argued that while race was a new construction, Western Europe has had a tendency to other folks outside of their cultures for a long time. Black scholar Cedric Robinson spoke to this a lot. And we can look to the way the Roma people, for example, have been treated for centuries to understand that Western Europeans have always had a sort of characteristic desire to call someone a barbarian, for example. And I would argue, and many others have argued this before me, that what makes race and the hierarchy of race that puts Europeans and whiteness at the top, really distinct from anything previous, is the factor of capitalism and the need to exploit labor to accumulate wealth. The idea of Blackness, you know, the Negro race, whatever, requires the stripping of tribal and ethnic identity from Indigenous Africans, rendering them subhuman and attempting to destroy the traditional cultures of Africans. And I say Indigenous Africans here because the overwhelming majority of the African continent is filled with Indigenous Black peoples. Black Africans stolen via chattel slavery are still displaced Indigenous Africans. And honestly, I have critiques of the way that global discourse around indigeneity rarely ever includes Black population. And I'll include some further reading afterwards about that specifically. Thank you. So the page from the atlas right here is a great illustration of racial hierarchy. Also, this is a family atlas, so just imagine that this would be in someone's home in the 1800s. It attempts to put humanity into different types. You see that the European is at the top center, and also notice how the European man is holding a pen and writing. That is to imply that the superiority of European civilization. And of course, I'm using air quotes because honestly, I don't care about white Europe. The groupings get darker until you reach the bottom of the page with Africans and people native to the Americas seen as the least or most inferior. So the ideologies of race and white racial hierarchy grew increasingly popular in Western thought and culture as capitalism violently expanded. And we can especially see these ideologies being disseminated in the writings on race in the 17 and 1800s. Next, please. I think the screen is having issues. Okay. We could just go back once.
Hey y'all, we appreciate your patience. We've been struggling a little bit with some technical excitement today. Let's call it that. This class is nonstop excitement. So I think we're good, but appreciate everybody.
Thank you, Paloma. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So an important part of the racial hierarchy that we live in which whiteness is at the top, is identifying who is at the bottom. So Blackness is constructed in opposition to whiteness under racial hierarchy. Edward Long, he was a white plantation owner, jurist in the 1700s. He wrote a book called The History of Jamaica in 1774, in which he asserted that Black people, the Negro, was so void of genius and incapable of civilization, indeed so far inferior as to constitute a separate species of mankind. As disturbing as that is to say out loud, it's critical to understand that Long's assertions were cited and helped support pro-slavery arguments in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. This white supremacist ideology, this racial hierarchy, was instrumental to the continued enslavement of Black peoples. Next, please. So now we know that under racial hierarchy, Black people are rendered inferior, stripped of humanity. So for this class, it's important to really understand the racial category of Blackness. And of course, note that Black people have self-determined and self-defined Blackness to mean a variety of things, including resistance, rebellion, community, joy. But for the sake of understanding anti-Blackness, we need to look at Blackness as defined by white supremacists and white capitalists. So this definition, oops, sorry, y'all, sorry. So Blackness is a capacious category essential to an array of political, economic functions, including accumulation, disaccumulation, debt, planned obsolescence, and absorption of the burdens of economic crises. At the same time, Blackness is the quintessential condition of disposability, expendability, and devalorization. So this definition is a lot. It has a lot of big words in it, but I really hope that what you take away from it is the contradictions that it contains. Blackness is essential to an array of political economic functions, but at the same time is disposable and expendable. So forced Black labor has been essential to the building of many Western European empires. And at the same time, we've seen law and policy for hundreds of years globally, dedicated to treating Black people as not human. Also, I want to flag the part about Blackness absorbing the burdens of economic crises. Honestly, I would go further and say not just economic, but also public health and environmental crises as well. You know, we're still in the midst of a global COVID pandemic that has laid bare how racist the US healthcare system is. And Black people have disproportionately died from COVID-19. And also many Black African nations have criticized the ways in which governments in the West, you know, specifically the United States and the UK, have hoarded doses of the COVID vaccine, so much so that the limited disbursement and access to the vaccine for people in the global South has been referred to as a vaccine apartheid. And regarding environmental crises, you know, we're in the middle of Climate Week right now. So Black people often live in some of the most environmentally vulnerable and polluted areas around the world. And I've been keeping in mind this week how working class Black communities continue to suffer the consequences of our ongoing climate crisis. And also how this crisis is predominantly propelled by only about 100 companies. So we have to make sure that the impact of economic, public health, and environmental crises on Black life are laid bare and given space in our conversations and our advocacy. Thank you. So the definition that I'm drawing from today, so we come to a collective understanding of the origins of racial hierarchy, race, and the racial category of Blackness. So let's actually now define anti-Blackness. So the definition that I'm drawing from today is one that's been on my mind since I first read it in 2014, actually. As scholar Nicholas Brady says, anti-Blackness is the paradigm that binds Blackness and death together, so much so that one cannot think of one without the other. Anti-Blackness is the living legacy of slavery. So anti-Blackness is a living legacy of enslavement. Could you press enter once, please? Thank you. It's an ongoing systemic violence against Black people globally. Anti-Blackness is the perpetuation of racial hierarchy under which Black people are seen as subhuman and the most inferior, rather. Next, please. We'll take a second to deal with some of these technical difficulties, or excitement rather. Thank you. So, of course, the ideology of anti-Blackness helped rationalize historical anti-Black atrocities. Some of the biggest being the enslavement of African peoples, as well as European colonization of the African continent. Chattel slavery and colonization needed foot soldiers. By this, I mean that anti-Blackness helped get poor and working class white people in line. You know, the slave drivers, the sailors on the slave ships. So in order for rich capitalists to make sure the rest of white society cooperated, you know, you spread the myth of Black inferiority, because honestly, you are more inclined to commit violence and not feel guilty about it against someone you don't believe is human. You don't believe feels pain the way that you do. Next, please. So I have these maps of the African slave trade, or the slave trade of Africans rather, just to illustrate the sheer millions of stolen Africans who were forcibly displaced during this time period. Also, most people only think of enslavement as transatlantic. Many Africans were stolen and enslaved throughout Southwest Asia, as well as South Asia. Next, please. I also wanted to include these political cartoons so that you all have a bit of an idea of the popular culture at the time. These cartoons appeared in circulated magazines and newspapers. The photo on the left shows Afrique, it's a French cartoon, so Africa, as a cake about to be sliced for white men, you know, signifying the various Western European nations colonizing the African continent. The photo on the right shows the horrible white man, Cecil Rhodes, a British colonizer who had a major presence in Southern Africa. You probably already know Zimbabwe was formerly called Rhodesia. I recommend, if you don't already know, please do some research on the Rhodes Must Fall movement after this class. This photo of Cecil shows him conquering, this flat Africa with one foot on Cairo and the other on Cape Town. He had this vision of a telegram line connecting Egypt to South Africa that went through all the colonies ruled by the British on the African continent. What makes me really frustrated and angry with both of these are that there's no Africans, there's no human presence in these political cartoons. You have no sense that there are human beings who actually live on this continent that's being colonized. Okay, next please. So now that we have a definition of anti-Blackness, let's shift focus now to who else participates in and maintains anti-Blackness structurally. The answer is all non-Black people, including non-Black people of color. I know people of color is a fraught term, I put it here, but people of the global majority, colonized people, I don't think that there's any unified term that we all use. But because of white supremacist racial hierarchy and the fact that Blackness as a category was formed in opposition to whiteness, all non-Black people can engage in anti-Blackness, fundamentally, full stop. So I'm gonna spend the next few slides doing 4 case studies, 4 examples of the ways in which non-Black people of color have engaged in anti-Blackness. Next, please. So I'm gonna start off with the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, also known as the Creek, and Seminole. These nations were called by the white settler colonial government as the 5 civilized tribes. I really hate saying that because white people should never be able to determine what is civilized and what is not. But in part, because of their willingness to participate in practices such as the enslavement of Africans, Christianity, et cetera. And this article that we see is from the Chicago Tribune in 1865. And at the bottom, it includes the numbers of enslaved people in the thousands held by 4 out of the 5 tribes, 4 of the 5 nations, rather. I also find the last sentence of the first paragraph really interesting. It states the position of the Cherokee Nation at the end of the Civil War, and I'll read it because I know it's small. Quote, "They accept the abolition of slavery as an accomplished fact, but do not wish the incorporation of freedmen into their tribe," freedmen being Africans enslaved. And this is important really to focus on because even today, many freedmen are still fighting for tribal recognition. As of today, only the Cherokee Nation, I believe, has granted freedmen, the descendants of Africans enslaved by the Cherokee, full citizenship. The other 4 nations, the Seminole, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, have not recognized freedmen as full citizens. And I hold the nuance that people make choices to survive genocide under white settler colonialism, but it must be acknowledged that anti-Blackness was utilized by those in these nations who chose to participate in the enslavement of Black people. This slaveholding does confirm white supremacist racial hierarchy in which Black people are at the bottom. Next slide, please. So Gandhi's incredibly well known. I don't know how many people know that he spent a significant time in South Africa as a lawyer, but I want to focus on that time period. His writings during this time were incredibly anti-Black. And honestly, one of his first legal battles was to get an additional door for Indians at the Durban post office in South Africa. Of course, there was an entrance for whites and for Black people and everyone else, so 2 doors. And he wanted a 3rd door so that South Asians wouldn't have to use the same door as Black South Africans. And I think that his anti-Blackness is best illustrated in a quote from a letter he wrote to South African government in 1893. And I'll read it out loud. Quote, "I venture to point out that both the English and the Indian spring from a common stock called the Indo-Aryan. A general belief seems to prevail in the colony that the Indians are a little better, if at all, than savages or the natives of Africa. Even the children are taught to believe in that manner, with the result that the Indian is being dragged down to the position of a raw native. He actually doesn't say native at the end, he uses the slur for Black South Africans, but I'm not gonna use that in front of you all. So reflecting on that, him saying that Indians are being dragged down to the position of natives of Africa, it's clear that his coming to racial consciousness and understanding of the injustices of racism, that'd be prevalent in his anti-colonial struggles in India later in his life, that was predicated on the belief that South Asians shouldn't be treated as the same as indigenous Black Africans by these white settlers. So moving on, I want to focus on Brazil, in part because Brazil stole and enslaved more Africans than any other nation in the world. Also, Brazil currently has the largest population of African descended people outside of Nigeria, so significant portion. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, and immediately the elites wondered how to change their perception as an African and mixed race nation. Those in power wanted Brazil to be seen as a white European state. They literally called the Black population in Brazil, the Black stain. Without slavery, they needed agricultural workers, of course. The plantations didn't disappear. So they decided to do, kill two birds with one stone by incentivizing the immigration of European laborers. So there was a decree issued in 1890 in which the Brazilian government declared that Brazil was open to free entry by persons healthy and able to work, except natives of Asia or Africa who can be admitted only by the authorization of the National Congress. So there was a very explicit blocking of anyone who could mess with the vision of whitening into a new nation. And we see this photo of, it's a cover letter from a Brazilian immigration pamphlet in 1908. And there's a bunch of lines being drawn from Europe to Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo region. And I think it's funny that Africa is completely ignored. And there was a hope that with an influx of white people in a few generations, Blackness could eventually be diluted and cleansed away. Some of the language that they use. And racial whitening as an immigration policy is not unique to Brazil. Other nations in the region, known as Latin America, engaged in this too. Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and others prioritized European immigrants in the early 1900s. In all of these nations, it was a concerted effort by non-Black elites to stamp out the Black presence in these countries. Okay, so I really struggled to decide whether or not to include Latasha, because I think often Black people who have died at the hands of police or anti-Black vigilantes are often not allowed to actually rest in peace. But oftentimes anti-Black violence in the public imagination is a racial violence enacted on Black cisgendered men primarily. So I really want to bring in the fact that the particular vulnerabilities that Black gender oppressed people face, I think it's important to center. And by that, I mean Black girls, cis and trans women, non-binary and other trans folks. Anti-Blackness doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it absolutely interacts and is enhanced by gender, ability, sexuality, class, and other factors. So also, this is tangent, but I really recommend that you watch the short film called A Love Song for Latasha, because it doesn't focus on her death, but instead celebrates the impact of her life on her loved ones. Latasha was murdered by a Korean corner store owner in 1991 because she thought Latasha was stealing a bottle of orange juice. an item worth less than $2. The fact that Latasha's killer felt that it was within her right to end Latasha's life for an item, I just have to emphasize that. Incredibly anti-Black. It exemplifies how dangerous and despicable anti-Black ideology is. She believed that Latasha's life was disposable. A lot of folks in her community felt that it was an injustice, that a murderer didn't get any prison time. And as we know, her death, along with the police beating of Rodney King, sparked outrage that led to the LA uprising of 1992. Some aspects of the uprising have been positioned as a Black Korean conflict, with Black people as the primary aggressor, noting destruction of Korean-owned businesses and property. But I think we should really recontextualize it as resentment, frustration, and anger at anti-Black violence and white supremacy. And I would be remiss to not acknowledge how the model minority myth has been used to position Asian folks over Black folks within US racial hierarchy. You know, the harmful and overgeneralizing stereotype put forward by white people that Asian Americans have successfully assimilated and achieved socioeconomic status is often followed up by, you know, if Black people just worked a little harder, stopped complaining, had better family structures, they'd be successful too. And growing up myself, like I heard this. So the idea that Black people can work our way out of anti-Blackness is ridiculous, of course. We absolutely know that. But it's necessary to recognize the tactics and the myths that are utilized in order to rectify and to continuously perpetuate white racial hierarchy. Next, please. So we know that racial hierarchy was constructed and has been maintained primarily by white people. However, non-Black, people of color, people of the global majority have also upheld the ideology of anti-Blackness at various points in history, because they themselves have internalized the belief that Black people are inherently inferior to them, and or they recognize that distancing oneself from Blackness offers more socioeconomic privileges under racial hierarchy. Or think about passing, for example. You know, we see the word passing thrown around a lot now, but the original context was actually within Black American communities in the United States. If you looked white enough and you renounced your associations with your Black family, you could enter white spaces that the majority of Black people were barred to under Jim Crow, under segregation. And also there's a reason why Brazil didn't want to be seen as an African nation on the world stage. Like Brazil understood that European countries had a lot less willingness to cooperate, do business with Black countries outside of, you know, the extractive colonial power relations. Nations in which Black people are the majority continue to be treated horribly by the West, especially when they try to self-determine their own fates. And I'm really thinking about Haiti, which I'm going to speak a bit more to in the next section. Next, please. So we're very briefly going to examine one instance of anti-Blackness and movement organizing. Since our goal is collective liberation, I think it's important to identify anti-Blackness in social justice spaces. I decided to center on immigrant justice because of this past week. I'm sure you all have seen and heard about the brutality and anti-Black terror that is being enacted predominantly against Haitians at the US-Mexico border, of course, a border on stolen land. The fact that Haitians are facing this violence is appalling, but it's not surprising to me, because the West, particularly the United States, has always wanted to punish and meddle with the sovereignty of Haitian people simply because they chose to free themselves from the bondage of slavery in a revolutionary way. We know that Haitians have had to pay a debt to France for their bondage. That takes up a large portion of their national revenue, billions upon billions. The US has decided also to be a debt collector. So even with the acknowledgement globally that the violence Black immigrants are facing is disturbing, Black immigrants are still often left out of the advocacy in immigrant justice spaces that instead centers non-Black immigrants. I really want to uplift the analysis of BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, on the Dream and Promise Act. So the act is a new attempt to offer pathways to citizenship for undocumented folks in the United States. And also the act has passed the House of Representatives in the US. Unfortunately, as you can see from these tweets, immigrants with 1 felony, 3 misdemeanors, or who have been accused of gang involvement, accused, you just have to be accused, will be rejected outright from this pathway to citizenship. And this is troubling because Black immigrants, and as we know, Black people generally in the United States are disproportionately targeted for arrests. Black immigrants are disproportionately targeted for detainment and deportations because Blackness is over surveilled and over policed. Also, it's because the Dream and Promise Act specifically calls out accusations of gang involvement. And we know, honestly, people who are accused of gang involvement experience that because of racial profiling. This act will absolutely leave many Black immigrants behind because Blackness is criminalized in the United States inherently. So I hope that those in this room who identify as organizers, activists, policy advocates really take from this the importance of prioritizing goals and strategies around the communities living in the most precarity. In this instance, we're talking about Black immigrants, but also any other people who are rendered invisible. Those are the margins of the margins, because when you prioritize their material needs, that's when you actually start to get to the root of an issue. Okay, next, please. So now that we have an understanding of white racial hierarchy and the many ways anti-Blackness manifests, how can we actually center the needs of all Black people in our liberation movements? Where do we go from here? So now I want to conclude by offering some advice for folks working to challenge anti-Blackness and dedicate themselves to the practice of honoring and respecting Black life. Next, please. And one more. So this one is specifically for my fellow people of the global majority. Anti-Blackness is a reality and something that has to be unlearned so that trust can be built. Give me 1 second, I need to plug in my computer. So we have to refuse to flatten our various racialized experiences for some false sense of unity. If we can't truly grapple with our differences, we'll never be able to develop long-lasting coalitions. Organizing around what makes us the same often doesn't work after a while because everyone is impacted by oppression differently. Not even all Black people experience anti-Blackness in the same way because Black people with darker skin, more traditionally African phenotype, are more likely to face anti-Blackness in public space than Black people with lighter skin tones because we live in a racial hierarchy that gives preferential treatment to more Western European phenotypes, hair textures and such. And the discrimination against darker skin tones is known as colorism. Discrimination rooted in phenotype is called featureism, and discrimination against more Afro hair textures is called texturism. So really the goal should be that we organize and principled struggle with one another, acknowledging the fact that we have different realities, that mistakes will probably be made along the way, but knowing that solidarity is an ongoing commitment and a journey. I think a great example of organizing across differences came earlier this year when Black women radicals and the Asian American Feminist Collective wrote a Black and Asian feminist solidarity letter in the midst of heightened anti-Black and anti-Asian racism over the last 18, 19 months. They spoke to in the letter, the history of cross-racial unity between Black and Asian feminists, how Black and Asian histories and futures are like intrinsically tied together. But also they made clear in that letter that Black and Asian feminists have very different experiences of gendered exploitation and colonialism. So while yes, our fates are absolutely tied up with one another, We also do have different experiences. Next, please. So speaking of solidarity, solidarity is not transactional. So the protester in this image has a sign. I'm not sure if you all can read it, so I'll read it out loud. It says, "My fellow Asian Americans, our Black brothers and sisters bore the burden for us so that most of us and our families could be here. Immigration Act of 1965. Time for us to stand and bear the burden with them." My issue with this framing is that the solidarity is based on the fact that Black people bore a burden. When we know the burden that Black people have bore in this country and globally is very non-consensual. Like, this sign makes it seem like it happened almost gladly and in a noble fashion, when Black-led struggles have sprung out of an urgent need to get free. I've often seen people point to the labor of Black people as their primary reason for solidarity. You know, the whole, oh, Black people have done so much that we've benefited from, without any mention of the simple fact that Black people have a right to fulfilling, joyous, and satisfying lives, full stop. It's actually anti-Black, because when non-Black people do that, they imply that the value of Black life with our labor, Black people only being, they imply that the value of Black life with our labor, Black people only being worth the labor that we do for others, is exactly what Nicholas Brady meant when he said that anti-Blackness is a living legacy of slavery. So solidarity is not quid pro quo. You don't do it so that you can get something back. That's what I mean by transactional. It's not a transaction. Non-Black people should really ask themselves, would you be so quick to claim solidarity with Black people if we didn't have a long and rich history of freedom struggles and coalition building? And that's something to reflect on. That's a rhetorical question. I really think that reflect on it and see if something comes up. And finally, I think this goes without saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I'm gonna say it again. Black liberation is inherently connected to all other liberation struggles globally. Without Black liberation, we cannot achieve collective liberation. Fannie Lou Hamer said that nobody's free until everyone's free, fundamentally. But also, like, these oppressions that I listed: capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, patriarchy, queer phobia, transphobia, ableism, fat phobia, climate catastrophe. Like, there are Black people who live and experience oppression at all of these intersections. And also, I included this photo from this pamphlet just because I think it's a beautiful sentiment. Like, liberation will come from a Black thing. Like, I think that's beautiful. Also, before we end this lecture portion, we'll move into Q&A in a second. I really wanted to highlight the fact that Black trans organizing, because I personally believe that some of the most revolutionary political thinking and organizing in the United States is coming from Black trans organizers. So I guess I'm saying Black gender oppressed people are the vanguard. That's what I believe. And yeah, I think that that's where I want to end this on. Next slide, please. So thank you all so much again for spending the last 40 or so minutes with me. My email address is on this slide if you have any thoughts or feedback. I also think, we'll move into Q&A now. Thank you all.
Wow, Maya, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Just I'm still trying to just come down from all of that. I was over here getting mad. I was over here snapping. I was over here hooping and hollering, all of that good stuff. But it's such a multifaceted subject.
Absolutely. I really actually cut so much from this because I didn't want to overpower. I really wanted this to be seen as an introduction in which you can do your own research and speak with others, speak with your community. Because I didn't even talk that much about all the other intersections that I wanted to.
Absolutely. But, we all have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I tell you what, the chat has been popping.
Yeah,
Speaking, yeah, I mean, people are loving it. But I think kind of like speaking of what we can do, what conversations we can have, this was sort of something that came up a lot in the chat from people of the global majority, from other people of color, mentioning that some of the most extreme anti-Blackness that they've experienced have been, folks within our own communities. And I think it's a tough conversation, because it's like the conversation, obviously it has to keep happening, right? That's like the only way. But I think there's a lot of folks that are just feeling like, what can I do when you're looking at your family and they're saying these really out of pocket things, and you're like, how do I address this? You know what I mean? How do I even begin to breathe life to this with the integrity and the respect that this deserves,
Yeah. So I think about, there's this book or like pamphlet called The Revolution Starts at Home. And I think that that's actually like a politic to live by, that in our domestic spaces at home with our loved ones, that's actually where we can practice the most uncomfortable, most intense and most transformative conversations, talking about the ways in which we harm each other. That's when we can make it clear that you can be a victim and also an oppressor. There's like, we as humans are complicated, often live like, as Audre Lorde put it, like we don't live single issue lives. Like, I think we have to lean into the both and when it comes to anti-Blackness by people of the global majority, particularly, that yes, white supremacy is a global thing. We've all experienced some form of colonialism, displacement, dispossession, but there's clear evidence that there is a racial hierarchy upon which some people can enact violence, like more than others. And that Black people, more often than not, and often non-Black Indigenous people as well, experience intense violence, and can, non-Black people, the global majority, can actually be maintaining and perpetuating the project of white supremacy. Like, white people did this on purpose. They purposely created a racial hierarchy to keep cross-racial unity from happening. When you divide and conquer, like, honestly, Robin D.G. Kelly, some other Black scholars have said that race is actually not for people of color, it's for white people. Because, when you give working class white people the idea that like, you'll always be a little bit better, they're gonna fall in line. They are gonna be the slave drivers, because they're like, well, I may not ever get to own a plantation, but at the very least I can, like, treat these slaves like shit. Oh, I shouldn't cuss. But I can treat slaves hard. Oh, I can cuss? Okay.
Well, I mean, we're feeling it. Like, it's real. So we like that. Yeah, there's just so much here. There's so much juice. There's so much. Wanted to see if there were, it looks like our Q&A is.
Yeah, if I may jump in.
Yeah, Celine,
help you here and to guide. So, you spoke about solidarity not being transactional. And I think that's so fundamental. There's so much here to unpack. And someone asked, can you explain transactional some more? And again, you can tie it with capitalism. You can tie it with the way that, we are being socialized to believe that everything we do exactly is supposed to be transactional at the end of the day, So in your word, how do you feel about this question? Like what comes out from you?
I think that what I was trying to get at is that when we're in solidarity with people, or you say that you're in solidarity with the freedom struggle, there shouldn't be an expectation that, oh, in a year's time, this person needs to turn around and be in solidarity with me. And I was thinking of that specifically because I think this year, this spring in particular, we saw like a lot of mobilization in Asian American communities against anti-Asian racism, imperialism, and the such, xenophobia. And I saw this tweet, I think it was taken down, but it was this woman saying like, oh, like all you who are out in the streets for BLM, like, where are you now? The sort of like, I don't know, it's just like, wait, why are Black people involved in this? We don't
tweet a lot.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't cause white supremacy. Like, why are we being called out? And so I think that's what I mean. Like there shouldn't be an expectation that somebody has to scratch your back when you're in solidarity. Like for me, I'm just like, I'm in solidarity. Oops, yeah, sorry. I've used my hands so much that I'm constantly banging and touching stuff. I'm an animated speaker, but I think about how like I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, full stop. Like, because Palestine should be free. Yeah. That's just it. Like people should be free. And so yeah, I hope that that's what people take when I mean that solidarity is not transactional.
Absolutely. And Sahba, you took the words out of my mouth. I saw that a lot also in relationship to the solidarity for free Palestine. Where are you, everybody who was screaming Black Lives Matter? Where are you now for Palestine? And I find that rhetoric so damaging and so wrong in many ways, because at the end of the day, it's not, again, as you said, it's not transactional and it's not conditional. And I would like to, it's not conditional.
Exactly. And I would also argue that when people say things like that, it's ahistorical, because there is a long history of Black Americans, Black people, Black South Africans have always been in solidarity, let's be real, with Palestine and Palestinian like apartheid by Israel. Like when you say things like that, it actually denies that there has been a history of cross-struggle unity and coalitions.
Yes, and this unconditional support is, again, anti-capitalist. This idea of transaction and anti-transactional is inherently anti-capitalist. And again, we saw some comments regarding capitalism being misunderstood by being like capitalism affects us all. But at the end of the day, capitalism doesn't affect us all equally. It doesn't affect us all unanimously. Some people say, oh, climate, even COVID is the great equalizer, and all of these false notions of equalizing. What are your thoughts on that? It's not in the Q&A, but this is just a special gift from me to you.
Yeah. So I think I agree that capitalism, of course, doesn't affect us all the same way. There are very real class divisions. And I think I immediately think about the ways in which people talk about Black billionaires. It's like this somehow sense of like racism being diminished because Black people can now be billionaires. And I'm just like, well, there shouldn't be any billionaires. Actually, that's just the fact. Like nobody should ever have that much wealth. I think there was something else I was going to say regarding capitalism. That capitalism is inherently racialized. I think that's something that I think often in spaces where, like, white Marxists, for example, love talking about capitalism, but don't necessarily want to talk about the ways in which it's racialized, it's gendered. Honestly, it's everything. And that capitalism wouldn't be what it is today without the slave trade, without colonialism. Like these things fed, aided, and abetted white European empires and how they accumulated wealth and capital.
Amazing. Yes.
That's great. I mean, I think it's so important. And I thank you for answering that, because I feel like it sort of ties in. There was another question in the Q&A about, someone was asking for instances when Black people participate in anti-Blackness. And my first thought was capitalism, and it's like, obviously, like you said, we all participate in it. And I'm all here for Black prosperity. I'm not coming for that. And I think that that's important to distinguish. But like you said, it's like, look around, there are plenty of folks participating in this very thing that we're trying to dismantle,
Yeah. And I think also our ideas of prosperity, like they can be anti-capitalist. Like we don't have to think about like the ability to live freely or to like have our health and like live in safe, strong communities. Like that doesn't have to be capitalist.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. And those are the notions that I think are inherently understood by the global majority, because the notion of access to water, access to land, access to air, what you were saying, and making this parallel between racism and environmentalism being now at the very end of the climate week was very key. for us here, because at the end of the day, it's, as you said, it's not distributed equally. This oppression is not distributed equally. And so when you centered the way that the harm can be done by the people of the global majority, non-Black people of the global majority, resonated deeply in the chat with a lot of us all over the world, the Arab community, because you focused on the United States and America and the Americas, but the Arab community was saying, yes, that is absolutely true. The way that it's being expanded and inherited from colonialism, but nonetheless, we are holding it. So at the end of the day, we're responsible of it. There's a question here from Sarah Dikralla. First of all, thank you. Thank you so much for this lesson full of emotions that I'll try to transform this anger into useful energy. My question is there any nation that is doing a good job when it comes to pay off their colonization on the African continent? May this world's population be, I don't understand, may this world's population become a better one. And once again, thank you. So I guess the question is, are you aware of any nation paying its dues or doing a good job when it comes to pay off their colonization on the African continent?
Oh, I'm gonna be honest. I don't think there is any. I don't think there is any yet. Because to be quite honest, like, I'm an abolitionist. I actually believe that I don't know if Europe can exist as it's currently configured if Black people are going to be free. I don't know if the United States can currently exist as it's currently configured if we're talking about reparations, if we're talking about harm. Because truly, the amount of wealth that African colonies, as well as Africans displaced in the Americas, the wealth that was accumulated for Europe, I don't know if we can even put an actual number on it. I don't know if we can actually even put a number on the harm. So I think real justice and real solidarity is dismantling the United States, dismantling empire, that. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's say that again.
Paloma, was there a question that caught your attention?
Oh, put me on the spot. There, I'm just I'm so
one
presently I'm in this.
I know.
I'm trying to focus, and also the chat is blowing up. So my
actually, you know what? There was somebody. Oh, here we go. Yes, from Julia Santiago. They said, you mentioned at the beginning wanting to talk more about Black Indigenous folks. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Yeah, and I also think that there are Black people who've written and can speak to this even more than me. And I'll make sure to include that in some of the resources. But I think that there is, because of anti-Blackness, people globally don't think of Black people as having Indigenous traditional cultures, Indigenous ways of looking at the world, our cosmologies. I think that often the idea of Black people, particularly in non-Black people's mind, is that of the slave, of the dispossessed, of the displaced, of the rendered completely nothing, of identity, of culture. When I think about the fact that my people, the Shabro in particular in Sierra Leone, are the Indigenous people of Sierra Leone. We were the first. So much of the myths and the creation, things that I heard, the stories that I heard as a child, that's Indigenous to Sierra Leone. And there's other various groups across the continent. And so I think that often people are what does that mean? But I think for me, that just means that the struggle of Indigenous Black people, Black Africans, is something that's inherently connected to the struggles of Indigenous people across the world, in the Americas, globally, Indigenous people in Asia, and so on and so forth. I think that it means more. It means that it offers actually more pathways for solidarity when we think about Black people and even displaced Black Africans as Indigenous to the African continent.
That's such a good point, because displaced Africans were and are still indigenous, and that's something that is lost in the conversation, in the narrative. Did I lose Paloma? Oh, here she is. I have a quick question here that is stuck in the chat from Tahsin. Curious to know what the redefinition of prosperity is in post-colonial and post-anti-capitalist world look like. What does it mean? And what does it actually look like in practice? What a cool question.
Oh, wow. I am like, I don't think I should answer that. Because I feel like the definition has to be communal. Like, no one person can do that. But for me, I think that I imagine prosperity as all Black people, all oppressed people, all colonized people in this world being able to have access to our cultural traditions, being able to reconnect. Like, that to me is something that I envision as prosperity, access to land, water, food, like our indigenous lands, access to like being able to walk down the street without fear, access to being able to exist in public space without surveillance, without policing. I think it's like no prisons. I think it's no police. I think it's access to like nutritious food, like all of these things. To me, that's what I mean by anti-capitalist prosperity.
I love that too, what you said about like communal definitions and really like honoring that space that you hold with your community, and that the things that you decide can be real, you know.
Yeah.
It's like we're so trapped sometimes beneath this binary linear structure that we forget that we can redesign it, you know. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Thank you to whoever asked that. I really appreciate it.
See, do we have time for?
We have time for a couple more questions. There's a question here from Sahba El Shawa. Anti-Blackness in the United States is so overt and violent. And although I believe anti-Blackness holds true around the world, I often wonder whether it's appropriate to use the resources created by Black American activists in an attempt to raise awareness regarding colorism and racism in other scenarios, applying the lessons learned to Arabs, for example, as in my community. Our struggles are interconnected, but I worry that we are co-opting specific movements for larger education purposes and disrespecting the organizers of the original cause. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, if it is not too much of a burden.
Yeah, so I think that there's a difference between citing and like learning from movements and like co-optation. So when I think of co-optation, I think of when non-Black people say like whatever lives matter, like I've heard like Native lives matter, like Asian lives matter, like that to me is direct co-optation, because Black Lives Matter as a movement is specifically centered around Black life, and we can be more creative and like name our movements other things. But I think, for example, like Black Americans who engaged in civil disobedience, I think many Black leaders made it clear, even though we just spoke about how Gandhi's incredibly anti-Black, a lot of people were inspired by his strategies of civil disobedience. They actually explicitly cited him. And so I think what I'm really saying is that the answer to making sure we don't co-opt is citation. Make sure you cite your sources. If you cite your sources, that's when it becomes a lot easier to sidestep co-opting.
Which brings me to this. I didn't even get to introduce you, but usually we it's okay. You were like, we were like, okay.
We were like, yes.
Yeah, I was like, oh.
No, but we usually do some housekeeping. So I know that you've shared with us so many gems, and I know people will be sharing them online. And this is an opportunity to remind everyone to please cite your sources. when you share what our instructors are saying, you must spell their full name out, link to their profile, and mention where you found them, where you found this quote, because taken out of context can put them into trouble. We've seen that before. It's not to just say it's open edu, but it is part of a class. So when you are seeing that, you are hearing that, citation is the foundation of our continuous solidarity movement, if you will, because we're building blocks together. And so when you are pulling from this talk, please make sure you cite your sources, in this case Maya Finoh, and then also finding her on Instagram, on Twitter, if you are in those platforms, and other platforms. Paloma, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I would love to see what caught your attention from the questions.
Yeah, it's so there's a lot of folks that are asking for further readings, which is great, because I think it goes again, like
I got you.
Do that homework. I mean, we will, just so everybody knows, we will be sharing Maya's resource list with everybody, all y'all, on Slack and the newsletter. But I'm sorry, I'm just trying to fill through. There's so many good ones. Someone just said, how can we support you? I mean,
oh, that's so kind.
I love that too.
You can follow me on IG, on Twitter, Savage X Fatty. Rihanna's gonna get me one day. I know. I know I'm gonna get that seat from this. Also, like, I would love feedback. Like, I love being in a conversation with people. So, like, feel free to email me. And my email was on the last slide, and I guess that can also be shared afterwards as well. Like, my Venmo is in my IG bio as well, if you want to do a little bit material support. But yeah, I really appreciate that question.
Celine, do you have anything else? I mean, I literally, I feel like some of these questions are going to get us going for like maybe 2-3 more hours. So I hesitate a little. I'm like,
are you sure? And I was like,
another class.
Sure you want to share your email, because you may get hundreds of emails. There were over 200 people in your class, and and the news goes to 20,000, if not more people. So I'm not sure we want to share your email.
Okay, well, no, sorry, y'all.
They have to watch the class to at least understand the context, because oftentimes people just send emails without understanding the context. Maybe one last question, if you don't mind, because this is such an important conversation that we all should have. And I'm so glad that this is a group that is mainly people of the global majority, and the conversation on anti-Blackness in our cultures needs to be addressed, needs to be looked at, and it needs to be resolved in I don't know if resolved is the correct term, but it needs to be dismantled, because, as you said, it is the foundation of all of our liberation. And we believe that tremendously deeply. And then, as you said in the book, revolution starts at home. Revolution starts within your own family, the way that you're raising your children and addressing race within your children, within your yes, with your children and their friends. And I have a question that's not here, but with the children right now, the kids that are online, they're creating these avatars. And I've seen that with my own children. They are creating avatars with no notion of race. So some of them have darker skin and black hairstyles and so on in the avatar. And the kids themselves aren't Black. They're from the global majority, but non-Black. And I've seen that firsthand. And when I addressed that with kids, I said, it's beautiful, but you should use an avatar that has your skin color. And it created such a dramatic response with the other moms that were basically yelling at me for doing that, because they're like, how dare you limit my children? And my children seemed to understand it very immediately when I said, explain very simply. For instance, you have the privilege to choose your color, the color of your skin for your avatar, but you're not understanding this context and how it exists in this world. And out of respect, you can't do that. Out of respect, you must refrain from doing so. And then again, I said it to other children that were also from the global majority, but non-Black. And it created such a tension, so much so that we don't talk anymore with those the parents. What are your thoughts on it? Starts at home and it's going to create conflict?
Yeah, I have thoughts on that for sure. So when in my definition, like when I was talking about the racial category of Blackness as defined by white supremacy, like Blackness is seen as disposable and expendable. Like Blackness is seen as a commodity essentially. And so that is why, for example, there's so much cultural appropriation of like Black music styles, Black hairstyles, etc. Because people actually don't see Black culture as sacred. To be quite honest, I think that it's just like people don't see Blackness as sacred, or that like the cultural traditions of Black people as sacred. And like, I know that there's been some conversations around digital Blackface and how people are so quick to use like Black, like, you know, reaction emojis and GIFs. And I think it's really like, you see Blackness as entertainment. And so I think that's something for children or like people who are using avatars that like don't reflect their own cultural and like race. It's because like they view Blackness as cool, as like something to enjoy, as entertainment, and not as something that's sacred. Like I ask that non-Black people view Black cultural traditions. You know, like the African diaspora is huge and widespread because so many of us have been displaced. Like view these traditions as sacred as you view your own.
Amazing your answer. Thank you so much.
Of course.
And then, of course, for you also, as you're looking through the chat, looking through the comments, if you're seeing anything that you want to speak on, because of course, it's not just us dictating the questions. There's so many interesting questions in the Q&A that we may or may not have time to take care of, but we will be recording them and attempting to answer them. That is the point of these classes. But just take a minute, just look around, because again, this chat is amazing, that people are commenting amazing things and really understanding what you're saying in a deep way.
Yeah. Let me look through some of these questions. I have one, like, what is the difference between anti-Blackness and racism? Catherine France asked that. So anti-Blackness is actually an aspect of racism. Like, of course, we know that racism is something that is enacted on all non-white people, like all people of the global majority, but anti-Blackness is a facet of racism that specifically is something that violence that is put on Black people. And because it's specific to Black people, all non-Black people can participate in it and maintain it. Yeah, if there's any other questions that you think I should absolutely answer before we end, please let me know.
There are some difficult questions. There are some deep questions. I don't know how much you want. There's also not that much time left.
Yeah,
but you know, you touched on maybe one. You touched on the situation in IET. You touched on the recent events this week, and just to bring it back to what's going on right now, to contextualize the importance of this conversation. There is a question that we recorded that was, I have a question here. With the recent horrible pictures going on the internet of border patrols on horses, I'm not going to describe the image. Yeah. You know, a lot of my Black friends have come up and said we should not have shared these pictures because they trigger bad feelings and strong emotions with the Black oppressed community across the world. They're triggering images regardless. I'm just adding that. That's not in the question. Yeah. I agree. But the person asks, I also think we need images like this to shake people and make them understand that this is a real situation and we have to speak up. What would you recommend? And what are your thoughts about this? I'd love to show solidarity, but I want to do the best way possible.
Yeah, so I actually disagree that we need to show these images, in part because I noticed, like, remember earlier this year, there was like large floods in Germany, like in Europe, and there was like intense damage, people died. I didn't see one image of any like dead Europeans, to be honest with you. I saw a lot of articles. I learned a lot about the fact that there was this like violence occurring as, you know, part of ongoing climate catastrophe, but I did not see any actual images of violence against these Europeans. And so I believe that because violence against Black people, remember when I said defined anti-Blackness, Blackness is tied with death. We are conditioned to view Black people as subhuman, inferior, and to see Black death as not that bad, as something, you know, we're used to it. We're so used to it. And so I think that we need to actively push back on the idea that you have to show Black death and violence against Black people in order for people to mobilize, because that also perpetuates the idea that people can only have outrage and be in solidarity with Black people if they have to witness and bear witness to violence against Black people. Like that to me is that's frightening, that we feel like people have to see violence in order to be in solidarity or to mobilize in support of others.
I couldn't agree more. From an Arab perspective, we have seen so many of our bodies decimated in the media, and it has not brought any sense of solidarity or any sense of support. So I agree with you. We don't need to lead with trauma porn. We do not need to lead with these emotions, because these emotions don't make massive change. They don't end up creating anything we want at the end of the day. And as the comparison you just brought to our attention, that we did not see any dead European on the media.
We did it. I don't know about you, but I have not really seen any dead Europeans, or like when we talk about violence or catastrophes that occur in Europe, I don't see that. And to be quite honest, like those of us who live in the United States, we've seen a history of Black death occurring in public space through lynchings. Like, so actually, like when you circulate these images on social media, you are perpetuating the public spectacle of Black violence and Black death.
Yes. And it's also a Judeo-Christian kind of perspective that through pity, we will be able to move people, but it's not true.
It's not true, because we are 400, 500 years into this. It's never worked.
Right.
Absolutely. Any last words? Because I want to conclude with something that you say, that it doesn't have to be an answer to any question. Any last words before we wish everybody a happy weekend?
Yeah, my last words are, I think that it is important for all non-Black people to take the time to really reflect on your internalized anti-Blackness and the ways in which you yourself have maintained, participated in anti-Blackness over your life. And make sure you challenge that. Make sure that going forward, you think about the ways in which you can be in solidarity and organize towards the goal of collective liberation, while also recognizing that we have different realities. Organizing across difference is critical to me for coalitions, for cross-racial, but also like coalitions broadly. So yeah.
Thank you.
Reflect, do your research, and also like, yeah, I love Black people. So yeah, that's it.
Perfect way to end.
Much. Thank you so much, Maya. It's been so wonderful. You teach with so much love, and it's so beautiful to hear you. I can't wait for part 2 next semester. And thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paloma. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Lo, for interpreting this class. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the Slow Factory team behind the scenes, capturing the best moments and answering everyone's questions. For the rest of the Q&A, we will record them and try our best to bring you these answers. But in the meantime, all questions are a wonderful way for you all to start your own research and to continue your learning experience, because learning is something you do to yourself. It's not something we impose on you. So thank you all for your questions. And that's it. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.